All right, I am Linda from the Upper Saddle River Library. We are very excited to have back for, I think this might be the third year running. We have Michele from Mah Jongg Life or Mah
Maj Life.
Life,
Maj Life.
like, and
Shortened.
um,
Shortened.
shortened. Yeah, it is a little shortened that up now. And she is going to go through the 2024 National Mah Jongg League card analysis. This program is being recorded, so I will send out a copy of the recording once we're done. I have muted everybody. If you have questions, if you want to put it in the chat, and Michele will go through everything at the end. Because she is going to cover so much, your questions may get answered before we actually get to that point. So with that, I am going to also mute myself and let Michele take it away. I know she's got a lot to cover for us.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. I'll share my screen. Oops. Let's see here. Here we go. All right. Everybody see my screen here? Okay. Very good. So 2024 card for the National Mah Jongg League. And my intention is to give you actionable insights and tips for a smooth transition. So you should be able to digest this information, especially with that ebook that Linda's making available, so that you can review it afterwards and make it part of your playing style. So I just want to say thank you to start with. I appreciate being welcomed back so much. It's very exciting to be able to share with you. I know we've had a little bit of time to play with the card, but there are maybe some statistics that you might find interesting that can help you with decision making. So I appreciate the time to be able to share these things with you. We're going to start with a baseline, and then we're going to get into nitty-gritty analytics and insights, and then I'll share with you findings with actionable commentary, and then I will end with tips for a smooth transition. For the baseline, the National Mah Jongg League publishes their card in April. And I don't know if we have newcomers in the room or not, but a lot of people get a little, or they question why April? Why do they publish it in April? I think it had something to do with their fiscal year, maybe, and they just never changed it. So every year in April is when they release the card, and we just have to wait. So our patience is tested every April. Also, the league publishes a guidebook. It's called Mah Jongg Made Easy. It's actually it's a booklet, so it's not like a paperback. It's more like a booklet, and in there are the rules of the game. But the challenge is that some of the rules are not in there. And as you know, the real estate on the back of the card is limited, so they can only put the most commonly asked about rules on the back. And then the other rules are in Mah Jongg Made Easy, but there are some omissions, and there are some rulings that have been given in bulletins and letters. That's where the MahjLife wiki comes in. So everything that the league has ever written is going to be in this wikis, which is searchable and on demand. It's free. So if you go to my website later, not right now, but later, and just click on wiki, you can use keywords to search for any ruling or even strategies if you like. So check that out afterwards and let me know what you think about it. If you have any questions after reading an article on a ruling, feel free to send me an email, and I have a contact form at the bottom of my website, or you can just email me, and it's my name at mahjlife.com. And that's Michele with 1L. When we get the new card, this is part of the baseline again. So they've established the same methods that they use year after year to describe the hands: colors, letters, numbers, and categories. Those all stay the same. So we can count on that. Now, sometimes they'll not put a math play category, which is the bottom left category. Sometimes they will omit it. And then sometimes they'll sprinkle math play in other categories, which we'll talk about a little bit later, I think. But if, just in case we don't, there's 2 math play hands in evens and in odds. But for the most part, it stays the same. What changes are the actual shapes of the hands and the patterns of the hands. And we're going to talk briefly about shapes and patterns. That is where the learning curve is for us each year. And typically it takes maybe a month or so, depending on how often you play. It takes a little bit of time to get over your own learning curve with those shapes and patterns. But for the most part, the game is the same. We just have some slight differences with the valid hands. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty analytics and insights. And just to reiterate, all this information is in that ebook. So feel free to review that afterwards, and don't feel like you need to take notes unless you learn that way. Otherwise, review that ebook afterwards, because it's all in there as well. And it goes a little bit deeper than what we have here in the presentation as well. The first thing I want to share is my process. What I do is I get the new card and last year's card, and I do a side-by-side analysis. I count the hands and the different shapes and patterns to try to get a feel for where the differences are to help shorten my learning curve. And then I share it with you guys so that I can hopefully help shorten your learning curve. When I do these hand counts, I count the lines as 2 when there are variations on one line. For example, with evens number 1, there are 2 hands on one line. It's essentially the same hand, one suit versus mixed suits. Sometimes different numbers are used, like in consecutive run, but I count those as 2 different hands, just so that you get kind of an idea of my starting point and how I get to the percentages, which we're going to look at now. The first thing that I want to talk about is the challenge in the card. The value is typically about the same from year to year. Most of the hands are easy, then we have moderate difficulty, and then difficult. The easy hands, 25-point hands, there are 67%. That makes up most of, well, most, I'd say, well, more than half. So we also have moderate at 18%. These are the 30 and 35-point hands. And then we have the difficult hands, which are 40 and 75 points at 15%. So there's enough challenge in the game for experienced players, and there's also enough there for beginners and intermediate players with those easy hands. And incidentally, if you're playing competitively in a tournament, playing these easy hands can really help you gain some scoring because they're quicker and easier to make. So if you win more small hands, you can win over someone who plays those big hands. So even experienced players can leverage these easy hands if you think about it in that light. The next thing I want to share is about the shapes. The hands on the card are really described in 2 different ways, the shapes and the patterns. The shapes are the blocks themselves. That's why I use these Legos as kind of a visual to help you think about the shapes on the card to help reduce any potential invalid mahjongs. We don't want to have an invalid mahjong. So maybe if you think about the shapes, it'll help you pause a little bit to make sure that you're checking the shape on the card before you get your first exposure. Otherwise, you could find yourself potentially in a little bit of trouble. So the primary or prevalent shape on the card this year is pung pung kong kong. Usually it alternates between pung kong and pung pung kong kong. So this year we've got pung pung kong kong, and that is in 11 hands on the card. So 15% at this level. So that is the most prevalent shape on the card, pung pung kong kong. Then we have pair triple kong. So you have a pair, for example, of flowers with 3 kongs. For example, that 3rd hand down under consecutive run. There are 7 hands there. And then after that, the numbers go down a little bit, but they're still prevalent on the card. Pung or pair, pair, pung, pung, Kong is the next one. Then we have triple Kong and singles. These are the math play hands. Those would be in addition, and then those two multiplication hands each in evens and odds. So it's triple Kong and then singles, or in addition, pair and then triple Kong. So a little bit different in between, but it's all math play. Then we have this next one. I call this a castle hand. To me, it looks like a castle where you have a Kong, then you have, or I'm sorry, my eyes went down. It's pung, pair, Kong, pair, pung. So it kind of threw me personally. I had to really stop and study that. There are 4 of these, the first one under consecutive, and then the first one under odds. Those both have the same shape. So just, we're so used to, I think, having the pairs either on the ends or maybe pair, pair, then pung, pung, Kong, or something like that. So it is a bit of a surprise, kind of like the math play hands. And then we have what I call a gate hand. This is where you have big multiples on the ends and then little multiples in between. This would be Kong, triple pair, and then another Kong. That I call, again, a gate hand. An example of that would be, if you look at the third hand from the bottom under Winds and Dragons, Kong north, Kong south with pairs in the middle. Also 3, 6, 9, that's another gate hand. Kongs on the sides, and then pairs in the middle. That would be the third hand from the bottom under 3, 6, 9. So there are a couple of those in there. And then of course we have pair hands. There are 3 where we have 7 pair. So these are all where there were 3% or more. And as you imagine, there are more. This is the list, only part of the list of all the different hand shapes. There are 10 with 2 hands each. And then there are 16 with unique shapes. And the bottom line here is that you just want to make sure that when your first discard is out and you want to maybe take it, just double check, first of all, that you're playing an exposable hand, and then double check the shape of the hand so you know what block you need to complete, whether it's a pung or Kong, depending on the shape of the hand. So now we're going to talk about the patterns. So the first one is shapes, where you have kind of the size of the blocks, and now patterns is where we're going to talk about the components of the hand with the numbers, letters, and dragons, of course. So here we have an example of, this would be the 4th hand down under consecutive run. The pattern here would be 2 runs, 2 identical runs. Single pair Kong, single pair Kong. So we have both shape and pattern. The pattern is a repeating sequence. This year, there are 23 unusual patterns, so make sure that you check again before you make your first exposure, just to make sure that you have the correct pattern. This one kind of threw me a little bit too, because it is a single pair and then a Kong. I think that years running, we maybe got used to single pair pung, and that's not quite how it works here. It's single pair Kong, so there's a big jump there in size. I also want to talk now about attributes, and these are going a little bit more in depth with the patterns and shapes of the hands on the card. And the first one is wins. There are 13 hands with wins, 18%, so not very many. And these numbers, by the way, are consistent year to year. They may change a few points, but I've seen that for the most part, they're not all that different. But it is interesting to see how some of these might impact other hands on the card, depending on what you're playing. So that's why I like digging into this nitty-gritty detail. So with the wins, 13, and you compare that maybe with dragons, for example, you see there are 19. That's 26%. So there are more dragon hands than there are wind hands. And by counting these hands, to me, that gives me insight into the defensive part of play. So I'll know when I'm passing tiles that I'll want to maybe pass winds before I pass dragons, because winds are in fewer hands and they're not as flexible either. Dragons correspond with number tiles. So, and number tiles are far more plentiful in the set. So dragons are more used than winds are used. 6 more hands than wins. So if you are going to pass dragons during the Charleston, split them up. And that applies also to wins. One of the things I've been telling myself when I come to the point of passing and maybe doing a risky pass, I tell myself that passing 2 dragons and passing 2 wins in 2 separate kind of passes, it's very close to passing like numbers, which is second to passing a pair in regards to risk. So try not to pass 2 dragons, try not to pass 2 wins. Now, depending on your hand development, of course, if you are well developed, then you can take on that risk. But I think it's a good guideline to try to break out the wins and dragons one at a time in each pass to different people. The next thing to note is Kongs of flowers. There are 9 hands, 12%, and then pairs of flowers. We have 21 hands at 29%. Together, that makes up 42% of the hands on the card. And this is why passing flowers is very risky. I would say 42%, that's close enough to half in my book. So I very rarely will pass flowers. And if I do, I would just want to make sure my hand is developed to the point where I can take on that risk of maybe helping somebody with their own hand development. Like numbers is another attribute that you want to keep an eye on when you're thinking about defense. 44% of the hands on the card use like numbers. And there are only 3 hands in the like number category, but they're all over the card, 44%. And that's significant, more than flowers. Like numbers are in more hands than flowers, which I find surprising. Next would be the difference between mixed suits and one suit. Mixed suits are in 70% of the hands and one suit are in 25%. So if you are focused on any given category, gather every suit or every tile, regardless of suit, as you go through the Charleston. And then when you run out of unwanted tiles, maybe tiles outside of your category, for example, then you can stop and look at what your options are and decide if you want to play in one suit hand or a mixed suit hand. So try not to be distracted by pretty one suit hands. And finally, multiples. American Mahjong is a game of multiples. If you look at the card, every single hand uses combinations of pair, pung, kong. And there are some hands with singles, but for the most part, you're going to have pair, pung, kong. I call pungs and kongs and the quints big multiples. Pung, kong, quint, 85% of the hands on the card use big multiples. And then we have 64% using little multiples, which are pairs. So if you think about it, that is going to be the strength of any hand. If you get your dealt hand and you have a multiple, whether it be a pair or a pung or kong, what have you, target that, because if you build with the end in mind, and American Mahjong is a game of multiples, that is going to be the strength of your starting hand. And then you keep tiles that support it and pick a category that will use most of your tiles. And that way you can optimize hand development during the Charleston and transform your hand from little to work with, or what maybe might look like little to work with, into something fantastic for when East discards that first tile. And this just summarizes it in a nutshell. American Mahjong is a game of multiples. Target multiples to optimize hand development. That's the bottom line with American Mahjong. If that's one thing you take away from this session, you'll see an improvement in your hand development during the Charleston. So let's talk about it very briefly, this process of hand development. Let me move this up a little bit here. There we go. All right, so when you first get your dealt hand, you're going to target the strength of the hand. Now, sometimes you're not going to have multiples, and that's okay. You're going to target the predominant pattern, and that will be one of the categories on the card. And you're going to choose a category that will use supporting tiles, as many as possible, and then you're going to gather. You're going to gather regardless of suit based on those attributes that we just looked at. And then you're going to eventually build your multiples, because American Mahjong is a game of multiples. So once you gather and fill in gaps, then you build. And along the way, you defend. That is the process of hand development. And sometimes you might have to start over, depending on what happens at the table. If someone discards the wins, and that's what you're trying to focus on in the very beginning of the game, sometimes you see those wins go down. But if they do go down and you're not ready to call, you might consider switching your hand and retarget a new strength, and then gather, build, and defend. Let's briefly talk about categories now. The first one is odds. And the reason I start with odds is because it's the biggest. It's got the most options within the category, 13 hands. That's 18%. There are odd tiles used in other categories depending on the tiles that you choose to work with. For example, if you're playing maybe the third hand down under Winds and Dragons, and or let's say the third hand from the bottom under Winds and Dragons, and you start with 3, 4, 5. Well, you've got 3s and 5s in there, so there are odds there. So think about that while you're playing, because these will give you those visions of whether or not you have any switchability between categories. But odds, biggest category, 18%. With consecutive run, we have 11 hands at 15%, but they're all, the consecutive hands are elsewhere on the card. Next, we have Winds and Dragons, 10 hands, 14%. And then we have 3, 6, 9. And this is pretty well consistent from year to year. Evens and 3, 6, 9 are usually about the same. And then we have 6 to 7 singles and pairs, this year 7. And then year hand, we have 4 in that category. Quints, we have 4. And then addition, we have 3. But remember, there are math play hands in evens and odds as well. And then, of course, we have like numbers, only 3, but remember that like numbers are all over the card. The next piece that I want to share are the powers and pitfalls. And these are, well, I'll just share. These are where you have really kind of like pros and cons. I call them powers and pitfalls for each category on the card. And you want to think about them when you're faced with the decision, if you have to make a choice between one or the other. So I'm going to give you some powers, pitfalls, and then a little bit of advice. And I go a little deeper in that ebook for you. So the first one is the power of the year category, is that you can thwart anyone playing the big year hand, the big 75-point hand. The pitfall is it uses only 2 numbers, 2s and 4s. And anyone playing evens could impact your ability to play a year hand. So the advice for this particular category is if you have 2s and white dragons, consider it. But make sure you're watching for 2s and white dragons, especially in the begin and middle game. If they go down in discards or exposures, you might look for filler tiles and switch to consecutive run, or maybe evens. For example, with 2024, if you get 6s and 8s, you could maybe switch to evens if your tiles go down. If you get 3s and 5s, or even 1s and 3s, you might be able to switch to consecutive run. So think about filler tiles when you're playing a year hand, just in case your tiles go down early. The next one would be evens. These have 2 what I call efficient tiles. The most efficient tiles in a set are 4, 5, 6, because they're right in the middle of a 9-number range. So they're very efficient. If you happen to get a 5, you can maybe switch to consecutive run and go up or down a range for extra efficiency and flexibility. And evens uses 2 of those efficient numbers. The pitfall is they only use 4 numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8. And we'll look at a bit of comparison as we go through the categories. Anybody playing a year hand is going to battle it out with anyone playing an even hand. So you want to watch exposures and discards to see if your hand is going to be impacted. And there's also limited switchability here. The advice would be to watch for 2s in discards and exposures to see who might be playing a year hand. If you get filler tiles, the 1s, 3s, or 3s, 5s, you might consider switching to consecutive run if you see your tiles go down, kind of like the year hand. With any like numbers, the power here is that they're in 44% of the hands on the card. So if you have only 1 exposure, you should be able to switch pretty easily. Of course, with more exposures than that, you're going to be committing to a hand. But with only 1 exposure, you should have really good switchability. The pitfall is that it's working with one number in mixed suits. So you have limited access to numbers. There's very little flexibility with the number, but there is flexibility with the hands and the choices that you have for switching. The advice I have is to consider like number hands in other categories for plan B. And also, if you're playing the 3rd hand down under any like numbers, watch out for anybody playing a big wind hand. I call them big news. So like if someone has a pung of north and then they put out, let's see, pung north and then a pung south, it's going to be really hard for you to get news. So just be mindful of anybody playing a big news hand. For addition, the nice thing about this particular group of hands is that I call these hands of slight resistance. And I call it that because there's only one pair with 3 kongs. So if you get your pair in your hand, you can use any number of jokers for the rest of the hand. And that's where the slight resistance comes in, that pair. You get the pair, and then you can open up to using jokers. And that can lead to a relatively indestructible hand, depending on access to jokers, of course. Also, it is switchable to consecutive run. So if you look at the first edition, we have 6, 7. Second one, we have, let's see, that one is probably not as flexible, but you could switch to big odds with 5, 7. And then the last one, you could switch to consecutive run with 3, 4. So it's a bit of a challenge. There's a little bit of flexibility, but not much. The pitfall here is it uses a pair of flowers. And if you've noticed on the card that there are 2 quints of flowers and there are kongs of flowers. So be very mindful to have your pair in your hand before you commit to more than 1 exposure. With quints, it uses a lot of jokers, but there's no surprise there. The pitfall this year is that there are 2 hands with 2 pair in there. So if you have a moment where someone discards a tile that you need for a quint and you commit with 1 quint, that's okay. You still have some flexibility, but make sure you have at least 1 of your pair in hand before you commit with another pair, or I'm sorry, another quint, because 2 quints out there and you don't have your pair secured, you could find yourself being disqualified if your pair tiles are used. Consider the category if you have a big multiple, like a pung or even a kong, and at least 1 joker. The more the better, of course. Make sure you have at least 1 of the pair in your hand before you commit with more than 1 exposure. Also, with consecutive run, this is an amazing category. It's the most powerful category on the card. I call it a powerhouse.
Well, you're back on the Zoom call.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay, so I'll keep going here. This is the big power here is that it uses 9 numbers in 3 suits. So you just have a sheer greater number of tiles to work with in that category. And the efficiency comes in where you have 3 or 4 numbers in a range up and down that 9 number set. So one suit, 1 through 9, and the hands in there are 3 to 4 numbers in a range, other than the very first one, which is 5 numbers in a range. So it's got built-in flexibility and efficiency. The pitfalls would be for this year, 2s and 4s. And typically the consecutive run category and most of the other hands or categories on the card are impacted by whatever the year is. So this year it's 2s and 4s. 2s mostly, but 4s to a lesser extent. So with this category, the advice I have is to consider starting your range at 3. And that way you don't have to worry about 2s. If anyone's playing a year hand and or evens, and you start at 3 with your range, then you don't have to worry about that impacting your hand. And also, while you're gathering tiles to support the strength of your hand, whether it be a multiple or the predominant pattern will probably be that it is a consecutive run, but you want to focus on 4 numbers in a range if you have mixed suits. Because if you look at the card, most of them are 4 numbers. Some have 2, and then 2 have 5, but those are 1 suit hands. So if you're gathering tiles for this category and you have mixed suits, gather 4 numbers in a range around the strength of your hand. Like let's say you have a pair of 4s. You can do 2, 3, or you could even do 1, 2, 3, 4. It'd be better to do 2, 3, 4, 5, or 3, 4, 5, 6, because then you put the 4 in the middle. Pardon me, you have greater flexibility. That's the beauty of consecutive run. Also remember that they're in other categories on the card. With odds, it's second to consecutive run because it uses 5 numbers. Odds uses consecutive run uses 9 numbers. So that is why it's a powerhouse. With odds, you get 5 numbers to work with. Most of these, though, are either little numbers, 1, 3, 5, or big numbers, 5, 7, 9. There are, I believe, 2 or 3 hands, the first hand and then the 4th hand down, that use all 5 numbers. All the rest of them are either little odds or big odds. So there is some split in here as far as the power. So it can be a little diluted, which is why it's not as powerful as consecutive run. It has limited switchability because there's a gap between each number. My advice for this category would be to consider it if you have no runs, or if your runs are really weak, you might consider leveraging the odds, especially if those are your predominant pattern or you have a multiple with an odd number. And again, if you're filler tiles, like if you have 1, 3, 5, and maybe you have 1, 2, and 1, 4, you might be better off to play little odds than switching to consecutive run. But it's very situational. Just consider that if your filler tiles are low or light, then focus on odds. But if you start getting those filler tiles and you see a run developing, you might consider switching to consecutive run if you're not dedicated or committed with exposures. For wins and dragons, there are 5 hands that use sequences. That's the power. The pitfall is you have limited flexibility. Consider the category if you have a strong representation of wins or dragons. There's only 1 hand in there that uses both wins and dragons. So for the most part, you're going to want to compartmentalize dragons and then wins or dragons, but not both, because there's only that 1 hand. But the nice thing is that you've got some number tiles to work with in here to give you a little bit of flexibility. You want to have strong representation of wins, especially because in the begin game, if someone is not playing wins and they got them in the Charleston, they're going to discard them pretty quickly, and it could impact your hand if you're not ready to call. Monitor the wins in the begin game for that reason. And if the impact is significant, you're not going to be able to develop the hand as quickly as you wanted because of that impact, consider switching to another category based on whatever tiles you're gathering. So if you're using number tiles like the 3rd hand down, the fifth hand down or the concealed hand. There's some switchability there, but try to switch at really before the middle of the game. Around 70 tiles is the sweet spot for switching to another category, because then you have enough wall left to pick and build. The 3-6-9 category power is that it uses like numbers. The pitfall is that it's got limited switchability, more so than any other category, because there are two numbers in between 3 and 9, or 3 and 6, and then 6 and 9, two numbers in between. So there's no flexibility there and very little switchability. The best category to switch to really would be odds. And that would be depending on if you can get 1s and 5s, really 1, 5, and 7s even. So it's a challenging category. You want to make sure that you have a strong representation of 3, 6, 9, and every number should be in your hand before you commit to that hand. If you have a gap, like let's say you have 3s and 6s, but you have no 9, I would advise you to play a consecutive run with 3, 4, 5, 6 and let it go until you get a 9. And then if you still have a predominant pattern of 3, 6, 9, now that the 9 filled a gap, then maybe go ahead and do it. But if you have a gap in 3, 6, 9, it's going to be very difficult to play that category. You could consider switching to like numbers because of the power in this particular category. And again, try to do it at around 70 tiles remaining. And that would be just a couple of picks from the middle of the middle wall, the third wall. The singles and pairs category power is hand value. They're the most valuable hands on the card, and they have switchability because each one of the hands relate to one category on the card. There are a couple of consecutive, let's see, 1, 2, 3 consecutive hands actually. Otherwise, each category is represented in there that you can switch to. The pitfalls is that each hand is very shallow. So you want to make sure that you're playing that category, not just because you have no jokers, but because you have a potential for any one of those, 1 or 2 of those hands. And if you are not able to develop the hand because of discards and exposures, just switch to the related category. And since you're concealed, you're going to have that switchability. All right, now we're going to switch gears and talk about problematic parentheticals. There are a few of them. The first one would be the year hand, number 3. The Kongs have to be either 2s or 4s, but not a mixture. So you can use 4s like in this case, or you can use 2s, but you cannot use 2s and 4s. Also, the quints, these two numbers, 2 sequences, double sequence, have to be the same number. Some people are confusing these parentheticals, so that's why I wanted to cover them. Also, the same thing applies to the 4th hand down under consecutive run. We have a double run, single pair Kong, double run. They have to be those 2 sequences in 2 different suits. And then in 3-6-9, the pungs, like pungs under second hand down there, they have to be the same. They're like pungs, but you can use either 3, 6s or 9s. And then this one really is a gotcha for a lot of people. This is another like number hand in 3-6-9. The dragons correspond to the number, and the 2 numbers have to be like numbers. So you cannot use 3s for one and 6s for the other. They have to be like numbers. But you can use 3, 6s, or 9s. And then finally, we have 3-6-9 with 6s in the middle. This is as seen on the card. Has to be 3s and 9s are the Kongs, and then 6s in the middle would be the pairs. Also, some people get a little confused with the term matching dragon, non-matching dragon. I call it an offsuit dragon. That just means it's a dragon that doesn't correspond to the suit. Also, it's in the singles and pairs. If you have a run, you're going to need the pairs of the other 2 dragons. That would be opposite the suit. Let's see, there are a couple of visual issues on the card. Some of these number or letters are really squished together. So just know that it's Kongs for Winds and Dragons number 5, and then Winds and Dragons number 3, north, south with Kongs. It got a little tight for them, and some people are having trouble with those letters being squished together. The carryover hands are consecutive run number 3, pair, triple Kong, one suit, and mixed suits. And then we have Winds and Dragons, the first hand, 2 different ones. And this one kind of blew my mind at first because they're so close together. I really am not quite sure why they chose to do that. They're just so close, but they are different and they carried over. These are the fatal errors. There's not too many, only 2. Pung of Flowers, which incidentally happened to me just last week. Somebody, I think they maybe hit the wrong button online because they had a Pung of Flowers, and there are no Pungs of Flowers this year. And then also there's no Quint of Dragons. So those would be the fatal errors. If someone has an exposure with these, then you can disqualify them and get more picks out of that wall. And you can have fewer opponents to defend against. The hot commodities every year are going to be year tiles and the white dragon. So you want to be mindful about passing these together. Try to split them out if you can. Your hand development comes first. That's your top priority. Then you mitigate the risk with the tiles you're passing. If you have to pass year tiles together, then do it. If it means that you're trying to optimize hand development. Otherwise, whittle down your options to pass defensively, especially if you're passing year tiles. Winds and Dragons can be risky as well. They're especially the dragons. These are hot commodities every year. Try to split them out one at a time in passes if you can. The top 3 mistakes when transitioning from one card to the next would be passing risky in the Charleston. And everybody plays a little bit differently. Some people pass defensively, some people don't care. If you're a defensive player and you're playing with someone who doesn't care about defense, then they're going to be feeding really nice passes to your opponents. So you might have that to contend with. But this is one of the reasons why I do this analysis, to help people consider passing defensively, because that is where the transformation happens with your starting hand. And everybody has that same opportunity to improve their dealt hand before East discards that tile. And if people aren't passing defensively, it could either help you or it can hurt you, depending on what happens at the table. The second one would be claiming a discard for an exposure on a concealed hand. That's number 2. Always make sure that you check for the X and the C before you claim your first discard. The last one would be something similar, where you might have a shape or a pattern from last year's card in your mind, and it doesn't fit the shape and pattern on the card for this year. So always just make sure that you're checking for the shape and the pattern of the hand on the card before you claim your first discard. My tips for a smooth transition would be to focus on strength. American Mahjong is a game of multiples, so target them. And then if you don't have multiples, focus on the predominant pattern, which will be one of the categories on the card. During the Charleston, if a multiple forms, reassess, target the multiple, and then choose a category that uses most of your tiles to support the new multiple, and then gather. The next one would be to practice, and practice makes progress, not perfection. You can do all kinds of exercises at home, and you can even do them online. There are lots of platforms that you can use to practice decision making. And I love Maj for practicing, because they've got an exercise room that allows you to do Charleston modeling and even chain reaction. You can do the Charleston with the same tiles in a repeat exercise. So you can maybe do a plan A and then do it again with the same tiles and do a plan B and compare the results. So these are some really great exercises that you can do. I believe I have QR codes or links to how you can do these exercises at home in between games, and it will help you transition to the new card very quickly if you practice. And then finally, practice by playing often and observe. Play with peers to relax and have fun. Play with advanced players to learn by observation. Play online between in-person games and watch my videos. And you can find me on my website, MahjLife.com. There's a QR code for you. I'm also on YouTube. I've got thousands of videos. And then also you can find me on Facebook, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions, whether through Facebook, or you can even send me a direct email if you like, with any questions you may have. And now we can open it up to questions if you like. I'll stop sharing my screen here. We've got 15 minutes for Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Michele. That was really helpful. And if you want to maybe send me some of those links and I can do it in the follow-up email, that will probably, the recording will probably go out sometime tomorrow.
Okay.
It takes us a little bit of time to get it together and to get it uploaded. I had muted people. If people either want to write in the chat or unmute themselves with a question. I did have one of the questions. So would you consider, with all of the sevens now throughout the hand, which I'm really kind of looking at it, would that be a hot commodity this year? Because it's in the consecutive run. It's pretty dominant, obviously always dominant in the odds, but it's also then dominant in the addition hands. So I hadn't really thought of that before, but it's that could also be a hot commodity, or no? What do you think?
I don't see it as a hot commodity. Because there's only 3 hands with those sevens. If you take those 3 hands out of the equation from one year, last year to this year, there's a nominal change. So I personally don't see it as a hot commodity. If you have sevens that you're passing, you still want to just pass one at a time. You don't want to pass like numbers. And if it's a 7, you could hold it and maybe treat it like a 2 if that's what your thought process is. Of course, you want to play by your instincts. And I have heard other people mention that sevens are a hot commodity, but since there's only 3 there, I just don't, I think it's nominal.
Does anybody else have a question for Michele or want to put something in the chat? Or as she was saying, I was telling her before, in my group, we have been making sure to not rely on what was last year's. I have had a few friends that they had a change after their exposure of being like, oops, wrong hand, let me rebuild. Let me read.
As long as you have one exposure, you should be able to rebuild if there's time remaining, of course.
Yes. So has anybody else been playing with the new hand? Do they find it better or not less?
I do have one other thing I wanted to mention, something else that has come up almost daily, I would say, and that is the way they worded 2 rulings on the back of the card, numbers 5 and 6. Okay, so let's just look at that really quick here. It says in number 5, this is on the first panel, number 5, when 2 players want the same tile for exposure, player next in turn to discarder has preference, except when other caller has exposed tiles. Some people are interpreting that to mean if they had a previous exposure earlier in the game, that they get the tile. But that is not the way it works. That's not the intent of the rule. Let me just read the second one and then I'll tie it up because they do relate to each other. When 2 players want the same tile for Mahjong, player next in turn to the discarder has preference, except when other caller has exposed tiles. It's basically the same rule, but where one wants it for, the 2 people want it for an exposure versus 2 people want it for Mahjong. So Mahjong always wins over an exposure, always. And the rule with this is that when a tile is discarded and multiple people want that tile, the player next in turn has the first right of refusal. they're the first one who gets to choose whether or not they want that tile, and then the players in sequence thereafter. The rule was written about whoever exposes, if someone calls and exposes tiles gets the tile. That was written only for the situation where the player next in line is not paying attention. So player next in line maybe is looking at their card. They're studying the card in their hand. They didn't hear the tile go down, and another player claims it, makes an exposure, and then that player wakes up and sees, wait a minute, I wanted that. It's too late. But that does not give license to another player to just slam up their tiles and call at the same time. That's not the intent of the rule. And this is one of I would say this is the most controversial rule written by the league. So I hope that that helps.
No, that is clear. Well, did they not write it that way before? It was always the next person? Or did they
Well-
change it up? I have to go look back at my old card.
I think this has been a rule since like 2017, so it's not new. But before then, it was always the person next in line. But the league had gotten so many calls from people who say that next in line wasn't paying attention that they said, okay, we're going to make a new rule and say, if two players want the same discard and another player calls and also exposes, they get the tile and the other player loses that opportunity. But it's not a speed rate. It's not a race. It's not this, what's being called slamming. It's not about getting your tiles out there first. It's applicable when the player next in turn is just not paying attention. So really what should happen is if I am player 3, so let's say player 1 discards, player 2 has first right of refusal, and I want that tile, but let's say they're not paying attention. What should happen is I should say, Susie, a 2 crack was discarded. Do you want that? Instead of just saying call and expose, you can avoid confusion and hurt feelings by just saying, do you want that tile? And that will wake them up and draw them into the game, and they could say no, and then I could call and make my exposure. So you want to be discreet if you can, because you don't want to out yourself, but at the same time, you don't want to show poor sportsmanship and just aggressively make an exposure to get that tile.
No, that was very clear, and that was very helpful. Once again, Michele, you always have so many helpful things. I will send out the links afterwards. So if you want to maybe forward a few things to me, that I will then go along to the group. As I said, this was recorded because Michele does cover so much. You guys all had the primer on the first email. If you need me to resend it, please let me do that. I will do that. And now we just all have to basically go out and play is really at the end of the day. We can learn so much, but then it's when you're actually playing. I think that you also then put some of this into use.
Yes, go forth and play, and may all your picks be keepers.